May 1945, somewhere over the Philippine Sea. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat shudders. White smoke pours from the cowling. Lieutenant Douglas Benson's hands grip the stick as his aircraft, tail number 47, bleeds altitude at 300 feet per minute. Below, the green islands of the Philippines stretch toward a coastline controlled by Japanese forces. Behind him, two Mitsubishi A6M0s circle like sharks sensing blood. His radio is dead, his engine is dying, and he's 40 miles behind enemy lines. The Hellcat was supposed to be invincible. Since 1943, it had dominated the Pacific skies with a kill ratio of 19-1. American pilots called it the Zero Killer. The Japanese called it the Grumman Iron Works, a flying tank that refused to die. But on this morning, over this particular stretch of ocean, Lieutenant Benson's Hellcat was about to become a statistic. What happened next would become one of the most audacious pilot survival stories of World War II. A tale so unlikely that intelligence officers initially refused to believe it. Because Lieutenant Benson didn't just survive being shot down deep in Japanese territory, he did something no American pilot had ever attempted. He stole an enemy fighter at gunpoint, and then he used it to shoot down two Japanese escort fighters before flying home. This is the story of how one Navy pilot turned capture into counterattack, transforming a death sentence into a legend. It's a story about split-second decisions, desperate improvisation, and the kind of audacity that only emerges when survival becomes the only option. To understand how this impossible escape happened, we need to go back 3 years, to when the F-6F Hellcat first proved it could change the course of the Pacific War. 1943, the Pacific Theater was a graveyard for American pilots. For 2 years, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had ruled the skies with brutal efficiency. Lightweight, maneuverable, and flown by Japan's elite naval aviators, the Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange almost anything the United States could field. American pilots in F-4F Wildcats learned quickly, never dogfight a Zero. Never try to turn with it. Your only chance was to dive away and pray your aircraft held together. The losses were staggering. At the Battle of the Coral Sea at Midway, across the Solomon Islands, American squadrons bled experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The tactical manual was simple. Use altitude, use speed, use hit-and-run tactics. But tactics born from weakness are exhausting to maintain. The U.S. Navy needed an answer, not just a better aircraft, a dominant one. Enter Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. The Long Island-based company had built the Wildcat, and they knew its limitations intimately. Chief designer Lear Grumman and his team didn't try to beat the Zero at its own game. Instead, they designed an aircraft that would make the Zero's advantages irrelevant. The F-6F Hellcat emerged from Grumman's design halls in June 1942. It was heavier than the Zero, over 12,000 pounds fully loaded compared to the Zero's 6,000. But that weight came with purpose. The Hellcat carried the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower driving a 13-foot propeller. It could reach 380 miles per hour in level flight and climb at 3,500 feet per minute. More importantly, it could survive. Grumman engineers wrapped the cockpit in armor plating. They installed self-sealing fuel tanks that could take 20 cannon hits without exploding. They built the airframe from stress-tested aluminum alloy that could withstand 7.5 G maneuvers and still bring the pilot home. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the Hellcat became a flying fortress. The armament was overwhelming. 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, each loaded with 400 rounds. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, they delivered 1,200 rounds per minute of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition. Japanese pilots described the experience as flying into a wall of fire. By January 1943, the first Hellcats reached combat squadrons in the Pacific. VF-9 aboard USS Essex drew first blood near Marcus Island, splashing 3 Zeros without loss. It wasn't luck, it was engineering. Within 6 months, the kill ratio told the story. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, American pilots destroyed 19 Japanese aircraft. The Zero's reign was over. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, America's first ace of the war, transitioned to Hellcats and described them as what we should have had at Pearl Harbor. Pilots who had flown defensively for 2 years suddenly found themselves hunting. The tactical manual flipped. Now American pilots could choose when and where to fight. By mid-1944, over 2,500 Hellcats operated across the Pacific Theater. They covered carrier strikes at Truk, Saipan, and the Philippine Sea. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats shot down 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day while losing just 23 of their own. The Hellcat didn't just level the playing field, it owned it. But here's where it gets interesting. Even the most dominant aircraft in history couldn't protect its pilots from every threat. And on a morning in May 1945, Lieutenant Douglas Benson was about to discover that behind enemy lines, even a Hellcat couldn't save you. What happened next would test everything he knew about flying, fighting, and surviving against impossible odds. Lieutenant Douglas Benson wasn't supposed to be in the Philippines. The 24-year-old Navy pilot from Portland, Oregon had completed his combat tour 3 months earlier. 57 missions over 2 deployments, strikes against Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands. He'd logged 340 combat hours in the Hellcat, scored 2 confirmed kills, and earned the right to rotate stateside for instructor duty. But in May 1945, the Pacific War was entering its final, brutal phase. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was 6 months away. Every carrier group, every air wing, every experienced pilot was needed. When Benson's squadron commander asked for volunteers to extend their tour, he raised his hand without hesitation. Now he was aboard USS Bennington, CV-20, operating 200 miles east of Luzon. His squadron, VF-82, had been flying armed reconnaissance missions over the northern Philippines for 2 weeks. The Japanese forces there were cut off, isolated, but still dangerous. Airfields scattered across the islands harbored dwindling numbers of fighters and bombers that occasionally attempted kamikaze runs against the American fleet. The mission brief on May 8th was routine, almost boring. 4 ships sweep over Clark Field and surrounding airstrips, the intelligence officer had explained that morning in the ready room. Suppress any aircraft on the ground. Avoid extended combat. We're not looking for heroes, just keeping their heads down. Benson's division consisted of 4 Hellcats. He would fly as wingman to Lieutenant Commander James Sweat, a Medal of Honor recipient with 16 confirmed kills. The other 2 pilots were younger, on their first combat deployments, eager and competent. They launched at 7:30 hours. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, scattered clouds at 8,000 feet. Perfect hunting weather. The flight plan took them west across the Philippine Sea, climbing to 15,000 feet before descending toward the target area. Intelligence reported minimal fighter activity. Most Japanese aircraft were being hoarded for final defensive operations. The real threat was anti-aircraft fire, which had intensified as American forces tightened their grip on the islands. Benson's Hellcat, Bureau number 58312, tail number 47, ran perfectly during the flight out. The R-2800 engine hummed with mechanical precision, oil pressure steady, fuel consumption normal. He'd flown this particular aircraft for 8 months and knew every quirk in its personality. The stick pulled slightly left in hard turns. The number 3 gun occasionally jammed if fired in bursts longer than 3 seconds. The canopy seal leaked rain during carrier landings. But it had brought him home 57 times. He trusted it completely. At 8:20 hours, Commander Sweat's voice crackled over the radio. Bandits 2 o'clock low, Angels 5. Tally 2, correction, 3 bogies heading northwest. Benson spotted them immediately. 3 aircraft, probably Zeros, hugging the deck over the jungle canopy. They appeared to be running supplies or evacuating personnel between isolated garrisons. Classic targets. Red flight, this is Red leader, we're going down. Echelon right, combat spread, arm guns, safeguards off. The 4 Hellcats rolled into attack position, diving from 15,000 feet. Airspeed climbed past 350 miles per hour. Benson's thumb moved to the gun triggers on the stick, feeling their familiar resistance. This was the routine, the standard fighter sweep that pilots had executed thousands of times across the Pacific. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested the next 5 minutes would change everything. Commander Sweat opened fire first, his tracers reaching out toward the lead Zero. The Japanese pilot broke hard left, diving toward a ridgeline. The second Zero scattered right. The third. The third aircraft wasn't a Zero. Break, break, those aren't transports, they're bait. Benson saw them dropping from the clouds above, 6 more Japanese fighters that had been waiting in ambush. They must have been tracking the American formation on radar, positioning themselves perfectly for a bounce. The sky exploded into chaos. Commander Sweat's Hellcat took hits immediately, 20 rounds punching through his left wing. He rolled inverted and dove, trailing smoke. The 2 younger pilots scattered, trying to maintain formation discipline even as Japanese fighters swarmed from multiple angles. Benson hauled his Hellcat into a hard right turn, pulling 6 GS, his vision tunneling as blood drained from his head. A Zero flashed past his canopy, so close he could see the pilot's face. He fired, missed, pulled harder, the Hellcat's engine screamed. And then came the sound every pilot dreads, the rattling thunder of cannon fire hitting home. His aircraft shuddered. The instrument panel exploded in sparks. White smoke began pouring from the engine cowling, streaming back over the canopy. The oil pressure gauge dropped to 0. Engine temperature spiked into the red. The R-2800 engine began missing, cylinders misfiring, the propeller windmilling unevenly. Benson was hit, badly hit. And he was 40 miles behind enemy lines, with Japanese fighters still circling for the kill. Stay with me, because this is where things took a dramatic turn that would test every survival instinct Benson possessed. The Hellcat was dying. Benson could feel it through the stick, the way the aircraft shuddered with each revolution of the damaged propeller, the way the controls grew mushy as hydraulic pressure bled away. White smoke had turned black, thick oil vapor streaming from bullet holes in the engine cowling. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning metal and leaking fuel. His altitude was 4,000 feet and dropping. The engine was still producing partial power, but every second brought him closer to the moment when it would seize completely. Through the smoke-streaked canopy, Benson could see the other Hellcats scattered across the sky, each locked in their own desperate fights. Commander Sweat's aircraft was heading east, trailing fire. The Japanese fighters pressed their advantage, diving and climbing in the kind of turning combat where the Zero's maneuverability became lethal. A tracer stream flashed past Benson's right wing. Another Zero was lining up for a finishing shot. He shoved the stick forward, diving toward the jungle canopy below. The Zero followed, its pilot confident in an easy kill. But Benson had one advantage left, the Hellcat's weight. In a dive, nothing Japanese could match it. Airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. The Zero fell behind, unable to maintain closure. Benson pulled up hard at 500 feet, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, gray spots dancing at the edges of his vision. The Zero overshot, sailing past overhead. But the victory was hollow. Benson's engine was finished. The temperature gauge read 280 degrees, well past failure point. Metal was grinding against metal inside the cylinder heads. He had maybe 30 seconds before catastrophic seizure. Below him, the Philippine landscape scrolled past, dense jungle broken by occasional clearings and dirt roads. Rice paddies, villages, and in the distance, a straight line cut through the green, an airstrip. Not American, definitely not American. The airfield was small, maybe 2,000 feet of packed dirt with a handful of structures at one end. Benson could see aircraft, several Zeros parked in revetments, a twin-engine bomber near what looked like a fuel dump. The Japanese flag flew from a pole near the largest building. His mind raced through options. Bail out over the jungle, guarantee of capture or death. Try to stretch his glide toward the coast, impossible with his current altitude and the engine about to explode. Crash land in a clearing, likely fatal in a Hellcat moving at 200 miles per hour. Or put it down on that enemy airfield and take his chances. The decision took less than 2 seconds. Benson shut down the fuel selector, killing what little power remained. The propeller windmilled to a stop. Sudden silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the whistle of wind over the canopy and the creaking of damaged metal. He was committed now, a 12,000-pound glider with one chance to get this right. The airfield grew larger. He could see figures running near the buildings, ground crew who had spotted the damaged American fighter. Vehicles began moving. Benson knew what that meant. They'd be waiting for him with rifles, ready to capture or kill the moment his aircraft stopped rolling. He dropped the landing gear. The hydraulics were shot, but the gear fell under gravity and locked with a reassuring thunk. Flaps down, partial deployment, the damaged hydraulic system giving him maybe 20 degrees instead of full extension. Airspeed 140 miles per hour. Altitude 300 feet. Rate of descent 600 feet per minute. The airfield's threshold passed beneath him. Dirt runway rising up, too fast, he was coming in too fast. The Hellcat's wheels hit hard, bounced, hit again. The landing gear groaned but held. Benson stood on the brakes, feeling them grab, release, grab again as the damaged hydraulics fought to slow 12,000 pounds of aircraft. Japanese soldiers were running toward him from the buildings. 50 yards away, 40 yards. The Hellcat rolled to a stop 200 feet from the end of the runway. Benson's hands moved automatically. Canopy release, harness quick release. Side arm, his M1911.45 pistol still holstered at his hip. He grabbed it, chambered around, and kicked the canopy open. Heat and humidity slammed into him like a physical force. The tropical air reeked of aviation fuel and jungle rot. He climbed out onto the wing, pistol drawn, scanning the approaching soldiers. There were at least 20 of them, rifles raised, shouting in Japanese. More were emerging from the buildings. An officer was running toward a truck-mounted machine gun. This was it, the moment where most pilots would surrender, hands up, accepting capture and whatever came next in a Japanese POW camp. But Lieutenant Douglas Benson had heard the stories about captured American pilots, about the beatings, the interrogations, the executions, about the B-29 crews who had been beheaded after bailing out over Japan. He had also heard something else, something that had circulated through squadron-ready rooms for months. A rumor about a Marine pilot on Guadalcanal who had stolen a damaged Zero, flown it back to American lines, and survived to tell the tale. And there, 100 yards away, sitting in a sandbagged revetment with its canopy open and prop already turning, was a Mitsubishi A6M0. Someone had been warming up the engine, probably preparing for a patrol flight. The pilot was gone, maybe running toward the commotion of Benson's landing, but the aircraft was running, unattended, vulnerable. What happened next shocked everyone on that airfield, American and Japanese alike. Time slowed to individual heartbeats. Benson stood on the wing of his crippled Hellcat, pistol in hand, calculating angles and distances with the cold precision of a man who had run out of alternatives. The Japanese soldiers were 30 yards away and closing. The officer near the machine gun was swinging the barrel toward him. Shouts in Japanese echoed across the airfield. But his eyes locked on that Zero, engine running, canopy open, maybe 100 yards away. He jumped from the wing and ran. The first rifle shot cracked past his head, then another. Benson sprinted across the packed dirt, legs pumping, his flight boots slipping on the uneven ground. He'd practiced emergency egress drills 100 times in training, but never like this. Never with bullets snapping through the air around him. 50 yards to the Zero. The Japanese soldiers were angling to cut him off, realizing too late what he was attempting. 40 yards. He could see the Zero's details now. The distinctive engine cowling, the red Hinamaru circles on the fuselage, the graceful lines that had made it the most feared fighter in the Pacific for 2 years. 30 yards, a bullet hit the ground near his feet, kicking up dirt. The machine gun opened up. The heavy slugs churned the earth in a line that walked toward him, too close, the gunner adjusting aim. Benson juked left, then right, running in a zigzag pattern that made him harder to hit but cost him precious seconds. 20 yards, he could see into the cockpit now. The instruments were labeled in Japanese characters, the layout completely different from American aircraft. But the basics would be the same. Stick, throttle, rudder pedals, how different could it be? 10 yards. He reached the revetment, grabbing the Zero's wing root and hauling himself up. The aircraft was smaller than a Hellcat, lighter, more delicate. The metal felt thin under his hands, like aluminum foil compared to Grumman's armor plate. A Japanese soldier appeared around the sandbags, rifle raised. Benson brought up his .45 and fired twice. The soldier dropped. Benson threw himself into the cockpit. The seat was too small. Japanese pilots averaged 5'6" and Benson was 6'1". His knees jammed against the instrument panel. The canopy frame pressed against his helmet. There was no room, no space to move, but there was no time to adjust. His eyes scanned the cockpit in frantic assessment. Throttle left side pushed forward. Mixture control looked similar enough. Stick center obvious, rudder pedals his boots found them cramped but functional. Instruments, half of them were incomprehensible Japanese characters, but he could identify the basics. Airspeed indicator, altitude, turn coordinator. The gun sight was different. The radio was useless without knowing frequencies or codes. The trim controls were marked in kanji he couldn't read. No time, figure it out in the air. Benson's left hand found the canopy rail and slammed it forward. The greenhouse-style canopy locked into place just as bullets began hammering against the aircraft's skin. The Japanese soldiers had reached the revetment, firing at point-blank range. One round punched through the thin aluminum near his right leg. Another starred the canopy glass near his head. His right hand shoved the throttle forward to the stop. The Nakajima Saki engine, 900 horsepower compared to the Hellcat's 2,000, responded with a high-pitched howl. The Zero was lighter, more responsive. The entire aircraft trembled with eagerness. Benson released the brakes, wherever they were, however they worked. The Zero lurched forward out of the revetment. More gunfire. The machine gun tracked him, rounds stitching across the runway behind his tail. He jinked the rudder left and right, weaving, keeping the aircraft moving unpredictably. The runway stretched ahead. No time for run-up checks, no time for control surface verification. Either this aircraft was airworthy or it wasn't. Either he'd figured out the controls correctly or he'd cartwheel on takeoff. Benson pushed the throttle to maximum power and aimed the Zero down the dirt strip. The acceleration was startling. The Zero was 6,000 pounds lighter than a Hellcat, and it showed. The tail came up almost immediately. Airspeed climbed 40 knots, 60 knots, 80 knots. The stick felt alive in his hand, responsive to the smallest input. Behind him, Japanese soldiers were piling into trucks, trying to chase him down the runway. The machine gun was still firing, tracer rounds arcing past his wingtip. 100 knots, Benson pulled back gently on the stick. The Zero leaped into the air. For one impossible moment, he was airborne in an enemy fighter, stolen at gunpoint from a Japanese airfield, with no plan beyond getting back into the sky and pointing east toward American lines. The landing gear retracted smoothly. He'd found the correct lever by pure luck. The airspeed increased. The Zero climbed at an angle that would have been impossible in a Hellcat, clawing for altitude with impressive agility. Benson banked right, circling once over the airfield. Below, Japanese soldiers stared upward, some still firing uselessly. He could see his abandoned Hellcat sitting on the runway, smoke still rising from its engine. And then he saw them. Two more Zeros climbing from the airfield behind him. They must have been parked on the opposite side, pilots scrambling to intercept the stolen aircraft. They were 1,000 feet below and climbing fast, their pilots skilled and angry. Benson had just stolen their squadron mate. Now they were coming to take it back. But here's where things took a dramatic turn, because Lieutenant Benson was about to discover something about the Zero that American intelligence had suspected, but never confirmed in combat. 3,000 feet, climbing. Benson's hands moved across the unfamiliar controls, learning the Zero's personality through touch and instinct. The stick required less pressure than a Hellcat. The aircraft responded to thought more than force. The rudder pedals were hypersensitive, the slightest input translating to immediate yaw. Everything about the Zero felt alive, nervous, eager to maneuver. But it also felt fragile. Through the thin aluminum skin, he could feel every vibration, every gust of wind, every tremor in the airframe. There was no armor plating behind his seat, no bulletproof glass in the windscreen. The fuel tanks, somewhere beneath him, had no self-sealing protection. One tracer round in the right place and he'd be a fireball. American pilots had a saying, "The Zero is a sports car, the Hellcat is a truck." Benson was now driving the sports car, and two very angry drivers were climbing to cut him off. He checked his 6 o'clock through the rearview mirror mounted on the canopy frame, a small rectangular mirror that gave a limited view of the tail. The two Japanese Zeros were 800 feet below, climbing aggressively. Their pilots knew this airspace, knew the aircraft, and knew that whoever was flying their stolen plane couldn't possibly match their skill. They were probably right. Benson had 340 combat hours in Hellcats. He'd trained in the Wildcat before that, logged time in SBD Dauntlesses during dive bombing qualifications, even flown a few hours in a P-40 Warhawk during transitional training. But he'd never touched a Zero's controls until 3 minutes ago. Every instinct he'd developed for combat flying was calibrated for American aircraft. Heavy, powerful, designed for slashing attacks and diving retreats. The Zero operated on completely different principles, light, maneuverable, built for turning dogfights at slower speeds. The airspeed indicator showed 180 knots. Was that normal climb speed? Too fast? Too slow? The Japanese characters on the gauge meant nothing to him. He leveled off at 5,000 feet and checked the gun sight. It was a simple reflector sight, similar in concept to American designs, but with Japanese characters marking the ranging rings. 2 small handles on the stick gun triggers, left for the 7.7 machine guns in the cowling, right for the 20 cannons in the wings. At least he hoped that's what they were. The ammunition counters showed full loads. Someone had armed this Zero before the mission that never launched. Benson had firepower. What he didn't have was time to test it. The 2 Japanese Zeros reached his altitude 1,000 yards behind him. They split, one moving high right, the other low left. Classic pincer maneuver. They'd try to bracket him, force him into a defensive position, then close for the kill. Standard tactics that Benson had seen dozens of times. But now he was in their aircraft, not his own. The high Zero came in first, diving from 6,000 feet with speed advantage. Benson saw the muzzle flashes, 20 cannon fire reaching out across the distance. Tracer rounds arced past his left wing, falling short. He should brake. The Hellcat playbook said brake hard right, use the dive to build speed, extend away, and reset the engagement. But the Zero couldn't extend from a Zero. In a straight race, they were evenly matched, and breaking away would expose his tail to the second aircraft climbing below. So Benson did something that would have been suicide in a Hellcat. He pulled the stick back and hard left, hauling the Zero into a climbing left turn. The aircraft responded instantly. G-forces crushed him into the seat as the horizon spun. The airspeed bled off rapidly, 180 knots, 160, 140. In a Hellcat, this slow turn at climbing altitude would have resulted in a stall. The aircraft would have shuddered, warned, then fallen out of the sky. The Zero kept turning, tighter still. Benson could see the Japanese pilot's face in the attacking aircraft as they passed, surprised, confused. The stolen Zero was turning inside him, something no American pilot ever attempted. The Japanese fighter flashed past overhead, unable to follow the turn radius. But the second Zero was climbing into firing position. Benson reversed the turn, snapping the stick right and adding rudder. The Zero rotated on its axis like a helicopter, the nose swinging around with impossible agility. For a fraction of a second, he understood what American pilots had faced in 1942. This thing could turn anywhere, anytime, pointing its guns at angles that shouldn't be aerodynamically possible. The second Japanese Zero filled his windscreen. Range 300 yards, closing. Benson's thumb found the right trigger, the 20 cannons, he squeezed. The Zero shuddered as both wing cannons fired. The recoil was heavier than the Hellcat's .50 calibers, a stuttering hammer blow that shook the entire airframe. Tracer rounds reached out, glowing orange lines connecting his wings to the enemy aircraft. The first burst missed low. Benson adjusted, pulling the nose up fractionally, leading the target. The second burst walked up the Japanese Zero's fuselage. 20 high-explosive rounds punched through the thin aluminum skin. One hit the engine cowling, another exploded in the cockpit, the third struck the fuel tank. The Zero erupted into flame. Benson rolled right, diving away from the expanding fireball. Pieces of the destroyed aircraft tumbled past, a wing section, the canopy, something that might have been the pilot. One downed, but you won't believe what happened during the next 30 seconds. The first Japanese Zero, the one that had overshot, was coming around for another pass. Its pilot had seen his wingman die and now flew with the focused rage of someone who understood they were hunting a dangerous opponent, not a confused American struggling with unfamiliar controls. This pilot was good, very good. He came in low and fast, using a split-S maneuver that positioned him perfectly on Benson's 6 o'clock. Gun flashes. 20 rounds hammering into the Zero's tail section. Benson felt the impacts through his seat. The aircraft shuddered. One round punched through the canopy frame behind his head, spraying him with plexiglass fragments. The Zero was damaged. How badly, he couldn't tell. He had one advantage left. The element of surprise was gone, but so was caution. The Japanese pilot expected him to run to try to escape. Instead, Benson chopped the throttle and pulled the stick into his lap. The Zero snap-stalled. Airspeed dropped from 160 knots to 80 in under 2 seconds. The nose pitched up violently, pointing almost vertical. The aircraft hung in the air for an impossible moment, suspended between flight and falling, balanced on the edge of aerodynamic physics. The Japanese pilot behind him had no time to react. His Zero, traveling at 200 knots, shot past underneath Benson's aircraft, overshooting by 300 yards. The maneuver was so unexpected, so contrary to every rule of combat flying, that it caught one of Japan's experienced naval aviators completely off guard. Benson shoved the throttle forward and pushed the stick neutral. The Zero's nose dropped, engine screaming back to full power. Airspeed built rapidly. He was now behind the enemy aircraft, positions reversed, the hunter becoming the hunted. But the Japanese pilot was skilled. He immediately rolled into a hard right turn, knowing the Zero's turning ability was his best defense. He could outturn any American aircraft ever built. That was doctrine, that was survival. Except Benson was flying a Zero too. He matched the turn, cranking the stick hard right, stomping rudder to tighten the rotation. Both aircraft entered a horizontal scissors maneuver, each trying to get inside the other's turn radius, a spiraling dance of machinery and physics where the tighter turn meant life and the wider turn meant death. G-forces mounted, 4 GS. 5. Benson's vision began to tunnel, gray spots creeping in from the edges. The Zero's lightweight construction meant less structural support, and he could feel the wings flexing under the strain. American intelligence reports had warned about this. Zeros could turn impossibly tight, but pull too many GS for too long, and the wings would simply fold upward and tear off. The Japanese pilot knew his aircraft's limits. Benson was guessing. Both Zeros spiraled tighter, losing altitude in the turning fight. 4,000 feet, 3,500. The jungle canopy grew larger below, individual trees becoming visible. Benson's aircraft was damaged. He could feel it in the controls, a mushiness in the elevator response, a vibration through the stick that hadn't been there before. That 20 round through the tail section must have severed control cables or damaged the stabilizer. He was flying a wounded aircraft in a turning fight against a pilot who had probably logged 500 hours in type. The smart move, the correct move, was to break off. Dive away, use the Zero's speed in a descent to escape, head east and hope to reach American lines before the fuel ran out or the damage worsened. But breaking off meant turning his tail to an enemy with working guns. It meant trusting that his damaged aircraft could outdive a healthy one. It meant gambling his life on a long shot instead of ending the threat now. Benson had already stolen an enemy aircraft and shot down one of Japan's pilots. Caution seemed irrelevant at this point. He reversed his turn, slamming the stick left while adding opposite rudder. The Zero rotated violently, skidding sideways through the air in a maneuver that would have ripped the wings off a Hellcat. The horizon spun. The Japanese Zero flashed across his windscreen at a 90-degree angle. Benson fired. Both 20 cannons hammered. The Japanese Zero was in a hard right turn, exposing its full plan form, the worst possible position. There was no way to miss. High-explosive rounds walked across the enemy aircraft's wing route. The first burst hit the fuel tank. The second hit the ammunition bay for the wing-mounted cannons. The Zero exploded. Not the clean fireball of the first kill, but a violent detonation that scattered burning debris across a quarter-mile of sky. The aircraft disintegrated, engine block tumbling one direction, wings separating and falling in different vectors, the fuselage breaking into 3 distinct sections. There was no parachute. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Benson rolled wings level and throttled back, breathing hard, his hands shaking on the stick. 2 Zeros destroyed. Both Escort fighters that had scrambled to intercept him were gone. The stolen aircraft had become a weapon. Below him, the Philippine jungle stretched toward the coast. East, safety. The American fleet operating somewhere over that horizon. Commander Sweat and the rest of his squadron, if they'd survived the initial ambush, would have returned to the carrier by now. They probably thought he was dead or captured. Benson checked his fuel gauge. The Japanese characters made no sense, but the needle was below the halfway mark. He'd been flying for maybe 15 minutes since stealing the Zero, burning fuel in combat maneuvering and maximum power climbs. How much range did a Zero have? American intelligence estimated 1,100 miles with drop tanks, maybe 600 miles on internal fuel. But combat maneuvering cut that drastically, and he had no idea how much fuel had been in the tanks when he stole the aircraft. The engine temperature was climbing. That damage to the tail section might have punctured a cooling line or damaged the oil system. The vibration through the stick was getting worse. He was flying a stolen, damaged enemy aircraft with unknown fuel reserves, no radio contact, and no clear destination beyond, east. Every minute he stayed airborne increased the odds of catastrophic failure. But he was alive. Against impossible odds through desperate action and split-second decisions, he was alive and flying free. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. Benson still had to navigate 40 miles of hostile territory, avoid Japanese anti-aircraft fire, and somehow signal his identity to American ships that would shoot down any Zero on sight. The coastline appeared ahead, a thin line of beach separating jungle from ocean. Benson descended to 500 feet, staying low to avoid radar detection. The Zero's engine ran rough now, missing on at least one cylinder, but it kept producing power. He crossed the beach and headed out over the Philippine Sea. The water was impossibly blue, dotted with white caps from the trade winds. Empty, no ships visible, no aircraft, just water stretching to the horizon. Benson turned northeast, following his compass heading toward where USS Bennington should be operating. Should be, might be, could have relocated, could be anywhere in a 100-mile radius. The fuel gauge needle dropped toward empty. The engine temperature climbed into the red zone. And somewhere ahead, American radar operators would be tracking an inbound Japanese fighter. He had survived the impossible. Now he had to survive getting home. 40 miles from the coast, fuel critical. The Nakajima Saki engine coughed once, twice, then caught again. Each misfire sent a shudder through the airframe, a reminder that Benson was flying on borrowed time in borrowed machinery. The cylinder head temperature gauge, one of the few instruments he could interpret without knowing Japanese, showed the needle buried past the red line. The Zero was dying. The question was whether it would hold together long enough to reach American lines. Benson maintained 500 feet above the wave tops, low enough to stay under most radar coverage, but high enough to glide if the engine quit. At this altitude, the Philippine Sea stretched endlessly in all directions. Blue water meeting blue sky with no reference points, no landmarks, nothing but his compass heading and hope. He checked his watch. 9:17 hours. He'd been airborne in the stolen Zero for 23 minutes. The combat, the kills, the desperate escape, all of it compressed into less than half an hour that felt like a lifetime. His squadron would have returned to Bennington by now. The combat air patrol would be up, circling the carrier group, and every American pilot in the sky would have orders to shoot down any Japanese aircraft on sight. Benson had no radio codes, no IFF transponder, no way to identify himself as friendly except the most desperate measure imaginable. He'd have to rock his wings and hope they held fire long enough to realize something was wrong. The engine coughed again. This time it took 5 seconds to catch, and when it did, black smoke began trailing from the cowling. Oil pressure was dropping. The damage from that 20 hit was finally taking its toll. Benson's right hand stayed on the throttle, feeling every vibration, every hesitation in the engine's rhythm. He'd coaxed dying Hellcats home before, engines shot up, hydraulics failing, electrical systems dead. But those were American aircraft, built tough, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. The Zero was a different animal. Lightweight construction meant battle damage cascaded quickly. One failure led to another, systems interconnected in ways that made catastrophic breakdowns inevitable once the damage reached critical mass. The oil pressure gauge hit zero. Metal began grinding inside the engine block, steel against steel without lubrication, the distinctive sound of an engine eating itself alive. Benson had maybe 3 minutes before seizure. And then he saw them. Contrails at 15,000 feet, 5 miles ahead. Multiple aircraft, at least 8, probably more, flying in formation. The geometric spacing and altitude meant they were American. Combat Air Patrol maintaining station above the fleet. Relief flooded through him, then terror. Those aircraft were between him and the carrier group. There was no way to avoid them, and every pilot up there was trained to kill Zeros on sight. It was muscle memory, ingrained through 2 years of combat. See the distinctive profile, squeeze the trigger, watch the enemy burn. Benson had seconds to make a decision. He could turn away, try to skirt around the CAP and approach from another angle. But his engine was failing. He didn't have time for detours. He could climb, gain altitude to make himself more visible, more obviously behaving in a non-threatening manner. But climbing would drain his remaining fuel faster and put more stress on the failing engine. Or he could do something so unexpected, so contrary to Japanese tactics, that it might buy him the 3 seconds needed to avoid being shot down by his own side. Benson rocked his wings violently, left, right, the international distress signal. Then he lowered his landing gear. No combat aircraft ever entered an engagement with gear down. It was aerodynamically insane, reducing speed and maneuverability. But it was also unmistakable, a signal that couldn't be misinterpreted. The Zero slowed dramatically. Airspeed dropped to 120 knots. The engine screamed in protest, trying to maintain altitude with the additional drag. The American formation broke. 2 F-6F Hellcats peeled off and dove toward him, section leaders responding to an unknown contact. Benson could see them clearly now, their profiles achingly familiar. Corsair blue paint, white stars on the wings, the solid, purposeful lines of Grumman engineering. His aircraft, his people, coming to kill him. The lead Hellcat closed to 800 yards. Gun range. Benson could imagine the pilot's finger on the trigger, the gun sight centered on the Zero's cockpit. He rocked his wings again, desperately, continuously. The Hellcat pulled alongside, 100 feet off his right wing. Close enough that Benson could see the pilot's face through the canopy. Young, maybe 20 years old, eyes wide with confusion. The American pilot stared at the Zero, at the landing gear hanging down, at the wings rocking back and forth, at the smoke trailing from the engine, and at the figure in the cockpit wearing a U.S. Navy flight suit and helmet. The Hellcat pilot's mouth opened in visible shock. He keyed his radio. Benson couldn't hear it, but he could see the pilot talking rapidly, gesturing. The second Hellcat moved into position on Benson's left wing, boxing him in. They weren't shooting, that was something. The lead Hellcat pilot pointed emphatically toward the northeast and made a follow-me gesture with his hand. Then he accelerated slightly, establishing a heading. Benson followed, the dying Zero struggling to maintain formation. His engine was down to maybe 60% power. The oil temperature gauge was pegged. Smoke streamed heavily now, and he could smell burning oil even through the sealed canopy. 5 miles, that's all he needed. 5 more miles and he'd see the fleet. The engine seized. One moment it was running, rough, damaged, but producing thrust. The next moment it locked solid, the propeller freezing mid-rotation with a horrific grinding shriek. The Zero became a glider. Benson pushed the nose down to maintain airspeed. Rate of descent, 800 feet per minute. Altitude, 500 feet. That gave him maybe 30 seconds before he hit the water. But ahead, finally visible, was the American fleet. USS Bennington and her escorts, 3 destroyers and 2 cruisers spread across 5 miles of ocean. The carrier's deck was visible, aircraft spotted on the bow for the next launch. 400 feet, 300. The 2 Hellcats stayed with him, escorts to the end. Benson could see sailors on the destroyer's deck, pointing upward at the impossible sight. A Japanese Zero with landing gear down, escorted by American fighters, gliding toward the fleet trailing smoke. 200 feet. The carrier was too far, he'd never make it. But one of the destroyers, USS Collet DD-730, was directly ahead, maybe half a mile away. 100 feet. Benson aimed for the water just off the destroyer's bow. If he could ditch close enough, they might pick him up before he drowned or before sharks arrived. If the Zero didn't cartwheel on impact, If the canopy didn't jam shut. If. 50 feet. He pulled the canopy release lever. The greenhouse canopy flew off, caught by the airstream and tumbling away. Wind blasted into the cockpit. 20 feet. Benson pulled the stick back, flaring the 0 for water landing. The aircraft's nose rose. Airspeed dropped to 90 knots. The tail hit first. The impact was violence. The 0's tail section struck the Philippine Sea at 90 knots, sending a shockwave through the airframe that felt like hitting concrete. The fuselage buckled. Metal screamed. Benson was thrown forward against his harness straps, the restraints cutting into his shoulders with bruising force. The aircraft skipped, actually bounced off the water like a stone, then slammed down again. This time the main fuselage hit flat and the physics of ditching took over. Water is incompressible. When 6,000 pounds of aircraft hits it at high speed, something has to give. The 0's lightweight aluminum skin crumpled like paper. The nose section folded back, the instrument panel collapsing inward. Seawater exploded through every gap, every seam, flooding the cockpit in seconds. The 0 cartwheeled. The right wing caught first, digging into the water and acting as a pivot point. The entire aircraft rotated violently clockwise, throwing Benson against the canopy frame. His helmet hit metal. Stars exploded in his vision. When the world stopped spinning, he was underwater. The 0 was sinking, not slowly, not gradually, but dropping like a stone. The engine block in the nose acted as an anchor, pulling the aircraft down. Bubbles streamed past the shattered canopy frame. The water was dark blue, growing darker with each passing second. Benson's hands fumbled for the harness release. His fingers found the metal clasp slippery, difficult to grip. He yanked hard, the restraints popped free. He pushed himself up and out of the cockpit, fighting against the suction as the 0 sank beneath him. His flight boots kicked against something, maybe the stick, maybe the instrument panel. Then he was clear, swimming upward, lungs burning, the surface impossibly far above. His flight suit was heavy with water. His boots felt like lead weights. But he kicked, pulled with his arms, fought toward the light filtering down from above. His head broke the surface. Benson gasped, sucking in air and spray, treading water in 8-foot swells. The destroyer was 400 yards away, USS Collett, already turning toward him, her bow wake building as she increased speed. Sailors lined the rails, pointing. Behind him, the 0's tail section was still visible, sticking up from the water at a 45-degree angle. As he watched, it slipped beneath the surface with barely a ripple, leaving only bubbles and an oil slick to mark where it had been. The aircraft that had saved his life was gone. Stolen from a Japanese airfield 28 minutes ago, flown in combat, used to shoot down 2 enemy fighters, and ditched in the Philippine Sea 200 yards from an American destroyer. The entire sequence felt unreal, impossible, like something from a fever dream rather than actual combat operations. But the water was real. The destroyer churning toward him was real, and the exhaustion flooding through his body was definitely real. Benson inflated his life vest. The CO-2 cartridge still worked, thankfully, and floated on his back, watching the 2 Hellcats circle overhead. One of them waggled its wings, a salute, a welcome home. Collett slowed to maneuvering speed and came alongside. Sailors threw lines. A cargo net went over the side. 2 men in life jackets dove into the water with a flotation collar. They reached Benson in under a minute, securing the collar around his chest. "We got you, sir, we got you." Hands pulled him up the cargo net. More hands grabbed his arms, his flight suit, hauling him over the rail and onto the deck. He collapsed on the steel plating, coughing seawater, his body shaking from adrenaline crash. A corpsman appeared with a medical bag. "Sir, are you injured? Can you hear me?" Benson nodded, still coughing. I'm okay. "Sir, did you just ditch a Japanese 0? "I did." "After shooting down 2 other 0s? "Yes." The corpsman looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Sir, with respect, that's the craziest thing I've ever seen." A voice cut through the growing crowd of sailors. Make a hole. The ship's captain, Commander William S. Brown, pushed through, his face a mixture of concern and complete bewilderment. He knelt beside Benson. "Lieutenant, I'm Captain Brown, USS Collett, you're safe now. But I need to know, are there any other Americans in the water? Did anyone else make it out?" Benson shook his head. Just me, sir. I was shot down over a Japanese airfield, stole one of their fighters, had to fight my way out. Brown stared at him. You stole a Zero. Yes, sir. From a Japanese airfield. Yes, sir. And flew it back here. Didn't have many options, sir. Brown sat back on his heels, processing the information. Around them, sailors whispered among themselves, the story already spreading through the ship at light speed. Lieutenant, I've been in the Navy for 18 years. I've seen a lot of strange things, but this— Brown shook his head slowly. This is going to take some explaining. However, what happened next would prove even more challenging than the escape itself. USS Bennington received the message at 9:45 hours. One pilot recovered, Lieutenant Douglas Benson, VF-82, ditched Japanese aircraft alongside USS Collet, pilot uninjured, requesting transfer. In the carrier's Combat Information Center, the radio operator read the message twice before handing it to the air boss. The air boss read it 3 times before calling the air group commander. Sir, we have a problem. Commander James Sweat, who had barely made it back to the carrier himself with a damaged Hellcat, took the message slip and frowned. Benson, we marked him as MIA. He was shot down 40 miles inland. Yes, sir, but apparently he ditched a Japanese aircraft. A Japanese what? That's what Collet reports, sir. Lieutenant Benson ditched a Zero after shooting down 2 other Zeros. There are 8 witnesses who watched him bring it in on one wing. Sweat looked at the message again, then at the radio operator, then back at the message. Is this some kind of joke? No, sir. Collet is standing by with the pilot ready for transfer. Sweat grabbed his cap and headed for the bridge. The ship's captain needed to hear this directly. 2 hours later, a destroyer came alongside Bennington for personnel transfer. The sea was calm enough for the ships to maintain position while a highline transferred Benson across, standing in a metal basket, swinging through space 50 feet above the water, still wearing his damp flight suit. When he reached Bennington's deck, the reception committee was waiting. Commander Sweat stepped forward first. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment. Sweat had thought his wingman was dead. The relief on his face was visible. Benson, you look like hell. Thank you, sir. You look pretty shot up yourself. Sweat's Hellcat had taken 620 hits, and his left arm was bandaged. The debrief is going to be interesting. Yes, sir, it was an unusual morning. That was perhaps the understatement of the war. The air group commander, Captain Harold Funk, arrived with the ship's intelligence officer and the squadron commander. They escorted Benson to the ready room, where a stenographer was waiting with a typewriter. Lieutenant, we need your report, everything from the beginning. Benson talked for an hour. The initial combat, getting hit, the forced landing on the Japanese airfield, the decision to steal the Zero, the gunpoint escape, the aerial combat, the ditching. The intelligence officer interrupted frequently with questions. You're certain they were A6M0s? Positive, sir. I flew one for 28 minutes. And you engaged 2 aircraft in turning combat? Yes, sir, I didn't have much choice. Lieutenant, standard doctrine says never turn with a Zero. How did you? I was flying a Zero, sir. It turns pretty well. The stenographer's fingers paused on the keys. She looked up, then continued typing. Commander Sweat leaned forward. Doug, I need you to understand something. What you're describing it's unprecedented. No American pilot has ever stolen an enemy aircraft in combat and fought his way home. The intelligence value alone is enormous, but more than that. Captain Funk interrupted. Lieutenant Benson, you're aware that every detail of this incident will be classified. Sir, the fact that you flew a Zero means you have operational experience with enemy equipment. That makes you a security asset. You cannot discuss this mission with anyone outside this room without clearance. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Good, because the Navy is going to want to debrief you extensively. The technical details, the handling characteristics, the performance envelope, all of it. You just provided us with intelligence that no reconnaissance flight could match. The debriefing continued for another 2 hours. They wanted every detail, how the controls felt, how the aircraft responded, what the instruments showed, how the guns fired. Benson answered as best he could, but exhaustion was setting in. The adrenaline crash, the near drowning, the sheer mental strain of the morning, all of it was catching up. Finally, Captain Funk closed his notebook. "Lieutenant, you're restricted to ready room duty until further notice. No flying, no liberty, no contact with other squadrons. The intelligence officers from Pearl Harbor will arrive within 48 hours for extended debriefing. Sir, with respect, I'd like to return to flight status as soon as possible." Funk smiled slightly. "Lieutenant, you just completed perhaps the most remarkable combat mission of the Pacific War. You stole an enemy aircraft, shot down 2 fighters, and ditched alongside a destroyer. I think you've earned a few days off." "But, sir—" "That's an order, Lieutenant. Get some rest. You look like you went swimming in your flight suit." "I did, sir." "Then get some dry clothes and some rack time. Dismissed." Benson stood, saluted, and headed for the door. Commander Sweat followed him into the passageway. "Doug." "Sir." "What you did today? I've been flying for 6 years. I've seen a lot of brave actions, but what you pulled off," Sweat shook his head. "That took more than courage. That took pure audacity mixed with insanity." "Just trying to get home, sir." "You did more than that. You proved something important." "What's that, sir?" "That even in their own aircraft, we can beat them. That gave every pilot on this ship a boost in confidence. Word's already spreading through the squadrons. The guy who stole a Zero and shot down 2 more. That's a hell of a story." Benson smiled tiredly. "It's a hell of a true story, sir." "The best ones usually are." The official report classified the incident top secret. For the remainder of World War II, Lieutenant Douglas Benson's mission remained known only to select intelligence officers and senior Pacific Fleet commanders. The strategic value was obvious. If the Japanese discovered that an American pilot had stolen one of their fighters and successfully operated it in combat, they might implement security changes or tactical modifications that would affect ongoing operations. But within the Navy's fighter community, the story spread anyway, whispered in ready rooms, discussed in quiet conversations between squadron commanders. The pilot who stole a Zero became a legend even while the details remained classified. The intelligence officers from Pearl Harbor spent 2 weeks debriefing Benson. They wanted everything: the Zero's handling characteristics, its performance envelope, its vulnerabilities. Much of what he reported confirmed existing intelligence estimates, but several details proved invaluable. The Zero's controls were lighter and more responsive than expected, requiring less physical strength for sustained combat maneuvering. The cockpit layout was logical and well-designed, suggesting Japanese pilots could transition between aircraft types quickly. The lack of armor protection wasn't just weight-saving. It was a deliberate design philosophy prioritizing maneuverability over survivability. Most importantly, Benson confirmed what American pilots had suspected. The Zero could be beaten in a turning fight if the attacking pilot was flying another Zero. The aircraft's advantages were not insurmountable. They were situational. The psychological impact on Japanese pilot morale if they faced captured Zeros flown by Americans would be devastating. The Navy never implemented that strategy. The logistical challenges and security risks were too high, but the knowledge itself changed American tactical doctrine. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the F-6F Hellcat had established the most dominant combat record of any American fighter. Total production, 12,275 aircraft. Combat victories, approximately 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed. Kill ratio, 19-1. The Hellcat pilots of VF-82 alone, Benson's squadron, accounted for 196 confirmed aerial victories during the war. Lieutenant Douglas Benson completed his extended tour with 61 combat missions total. His official record credited him with 4 aerial victories: the 2 Zeros shot down while flying the Hellcat during the initial ambush, and the 2 destroyed while flying the stolen Zero. Navy bureaucrats debated whether the latter 2 should count as friendly fire, since he was technically flying a Japanese aircraft, but Commander Sweat personally ensured they were properly credited. After the war, Benson left active duty and returned to Oregon. He rarely discussed his most famous mission, honoring the classification requirements even after they were lifted in 1952. In the few interviews he gave, he downplayed the heroics. "I didn't set out to steal an aircraft," he said in a 1967 interview with Naval Aviation News. "I set out to survive. The Zero was just the tool available. Any pilot would have done the same thing in that situation. But that wasn't true. Most pilots would have surrendered, would have accepted capture rather than attempting something so audacious. Benson's decision, made in seconds under fire, required a unique combination of desperation, skill, and pure audacity. The stolen Zero itself was never recovered. It sank in water over 1,000 feet deep, taking with it the physical evidence of one of the war's most remarkable combat actions. Only the witness statements, the debriefing reports, and the memories of sailors aboard USS Collet preserved the story. Looking back, Benson's mission represented something larger than one pilot's survival. It demonstrated that American naval aviators had evolved from the desperate, defensive pilots of 1942 into confident, aggressive fighters who could outthink and outfight their opponents even in disadvantageous circumstances. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. The Hellcat gave American pilots the tools. Pilots like Benson provided the audacity. Today, aviation historians consider the incident one of the most unusual combat actions of World War II. No other pilot in any air force successfully stole an enemy fighter during combat operations, fought aerial engagements in it, and returned to friendly forces. The uniqueness of the achievement has never been replicated. Douglas Benson passed away in 1998 at age 77. His obituary in the Oregonian mentioned his Navy service and his Distinguished Flying Cross, but only briefly referenced unusual combat operations in the Pacific Theater. Most readers had no idea they were reading about one of aviation history's most audacious missions. The F-6F Hellcat, the aircraft he was originally flying when shot down, remains one of the most successful fighter aircraft ever built. Museums across the United States maintain airworthy examples, and the sound of that R-2800 engine still draws crowds at airshows. But no museum displays the other aircraft from Benson's mission. The stolen Zero rests somewhere on the floor of the Philippine Sea, a silent monument to desperation, improvisation, and the kind of audacity that defines legends. So there you have it, the complete story of Lieutenant Douglas Benson and the day he stole a Zero at gunpoint. From a forced landing on an enemy airfield to aerial combat in a stolen fighter, from shooting down 2 Japanese escorts to ditching alongside an American destroyer. This mission proved that survival sometimes requires actions so audacious they seem impossible. The F-6F Hellcat went on to become the U.S. Navy's most successful fighter, with over 12,000 built and a kill ratio that remains unmatched. But on that May morning in 1945, it was a different aircraft, a captured Zero, that became the tool of survival for one American pilot who refused to surrender. 2 confirmed kills while flying enemy equipment. 28 minutes of combat in an aircraft he'd never touched before. A water landing that should have been fatal. And a return to American forces that intelligence officers initially refused to believe. What impressed you most about this incredible true story? Was it the audacity of stealing the Zero, the aerial combat that followed, or the sheer determination to survive against impossible odds? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into World War II's most remarkable combat missions and the pilots who flew them, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching WW2 Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.